Hello, I'm Mark Anderson. Welcome to the third edition of Stop the Presses, a periodic exploratory news program that cuts to the heart of issues often overlooked by mainstream and even by some alternative news outlets. While mainstream news is sometimes fake, misleading, unreliable, and shallow, I aim to take on challenging issues that are either totally ignored, downplayed, or mishandled. Having been a journalist for some 33 years, I've covered local, provincial, and national and international issues here in the U.S., Canada, here in the UK, and beyond, including on Capitol Hill, covering U.S. Congress, where I'm credentialed to do so. Today, here in June 2018, for the third edition of Stop the Presses, I welcome once again John DeVINE, a longtime former business owner, activist, and alternative media co-editor with the Awakening News, an online publication based in Ontario, Canada. Thanks for being with me again, John.
Thank you for inviting.
Great. Now, here I'm going to show a slide that's sort of an all-encompassing issue that you've covered, the time machine. Before we get into some important little-known casino issues that go on across Canada and affect other parts of the world, and the corruption and many things that follow from that, the corruption of the media included, explain what the time machine is. This is one of the most intriguing articles that the Awakening News has ran. What is this about?
Well, it is the fact that there's issues come forward and they get tabled in the media, and then all of a sudden they fall off the radar screen. And the reason why nobody can talk about it is because it's under investigation. And we just had one scandal that just all of a sudden surfaced again after 5 years in the time machine, and they said they didn't find anything that was wrong. But it just kind of gets tucked away, and they hope that time will go by. And they always use the excuse that we can't talk about it because it's under investigation. And some of the stuff thrown in the time machine is still there. Example, the property rights issue, the Dell Holding ruling, that has never ever been addressed properly. It's been there now for going on 2 decades.
And isn't this, just briefly visiting this, isn't this why the residential schools and the abuse and apparent murder of children that happened some decades ago in Canada, isn't this time machine a factor there too? In other words, things are never addressed when they're happening, and this is especially deep-seated in Canada. Rather, it's under investigation, like you say. At the time that it's going on, everything is swept under the rug, and by the time they form reconciliation commissions and they want to deal with the issue, all the parties who were affected or involved in these scandals are either elderly or dead, correct?
That's correct. And what they do now is expect our grandchildren to pay for the sins of the past, because we don't have any cash on hand to pay for the sins of the past, so we got to borrow it. And people that aren't even born in Canada yet, when they are born and become an adult, they're going to be paying for things that were put in the time machine.
Interesting. And this happens in other countries, I'm sure, but from what I've seen, John, and I know much more from what you've told me, it's a much more deep-seated thing. Canada has a particularly passive society in many ways, and it's kind of placid waters. The government always wants to give you the idea that everything's fine. Lake Placid, 100% 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And so these things are tucked away, nothing to see here, folks. They're put into this time machine until it's too late to be dealing with things in real time. And we'll come back to this concept once or twice during this third episode of Stop the Presses to see how this actually applies to concrete issues. But we're going to go right to the chase here with the casino issues and explaining just how much casinos can be problematic to society in so many ways, and how overlooked this is in much, if not all, of the press. And we're going to look at something called the Wilson letter, just cutting right to the chase here. And let's put that on the screen and explain what the Wilson letter is, John. And we'll show the actual letter here in a few minutes. But who is Mr. Wilson, and what is this all about?
At the time I wrote to the leader of the Conservative Party, they were in opposition, still are. Mr. Wilson was the interim leader, and I mailed him a whole package of documents detailing all of the human rights violations at Casino Rama: sexual abuse, physical abuse, and verbal assaults, etc. It affected Wilson enough that he wrote a letter to Premier Wynne asking her to investigate it. And shortly thereafter, Wilson steps down as interim position and a leader comes along. Now, I wrote from 2015, I'm sorry, to the present, asking the status of the Wilson letter, because somebody's got to respond to this, because we were blowing the whistle on serious, serious issues, one of which was assaults on women, which has now hit the radar screen in a big fashion around the world. And yet nobody responds to the Wilson letter. So there was 2 elections just come up here in the last 6 months. There was an election to vote in the new leader of the Conservative Party once again, and there was a story behind that one, but I'll leave that one and move you forward. Then there's another election come up in regards to the provincial election, which is happening today. But all the candidates I wrote in regards to the Wilson letter and asked them what they would do about it and inform the public about it, nobody replied. So here we're going to have a new premier today, and we have no idea whether that new premier is going to say, okay, I'm going to find out what's gone wrong with the Wilson letter. Silence is again the trump card.
And just to clarify, Mr. Wilson, a MPP or an MP?
MPP, Member Provincial Parliament.
He wrote the letter to the current Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, correct?
That's correct.
And when he received a package from you, the letter was written to Wynne referring to what you had written to him, correct?
Yes, yeah, numerous documents of what we recorded under the casino. You see, I ended up working at the casino after I lost Fisherman's Cove. So I was there for 15 years. I've seen it all. I've kept diaries and documentation, et cetera. So there's some serious problem there. And the one that conflicts with me is that under the roof of the casino, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation says nothing, but yet they did a report a week or 2 ago about a Catholic archbishop in Australia being sentenced to jail for enabling. But yet the CBC is enabling what's going on under the roof of the casino.
In other words, certain abuses are condemned or censored, such as in Australia, other places, and yet right under the roof of this casino, and by no means is it limited to just Casino-Rama in Ontario, you have really daily goings-on of various labor law breaches, as I understand it, sexual assaults by customers on the employees at the casino. And you've told me many other things, that the casino addictions lead to thousands of citizens over the course of time sleeping in their cars outside casinos, coming in all soiled, sometimes getting in bankruptcies, falling behind on child support payments. Even the trafficking of children is strongly linked to casino gambling and the debts and the degradation and losses that can go along with this. So, and of course, petty crimes, robberies, extortions, embezzlements, as people get deeper and deeper into debt. As many people know, you go into a casino, you can buy a credit card just to gamble with. You're already gambling when you go up to the slot machine, and then you put that on a credit card. It's a double whammy. But suffice to say, it creates a very economically volatile situation. And you were telling me that even workplace hazards are not being abated that can affect both customers and employees, correct?
Yeah, that was one of the 2 issues that cost me my job, because there was people continually receiving head trauma from one particular hazard of many, many hazards in the place. And that particular hazard has placed a cloud over the death of one employee and the lifetime illness of another employee. And I'm trying to blow the whistle on the situation. And the next thing, I'm out of a job and the police are at my door threatening me for trying to expose it. But that wasn't the first time I was threatened. I was threatened by the manager of the Casino-Rama Penn National when I was trying to expose violation of NAFTA under that roof of the casino, and that being the stealing of intellectual property from the U.S. movie producers. And that was quashed. And then subsequently, my intellectual property was stolen out of the hands of my readers, and that was quashed. So I wrote to the police, and they told me where to go, Ministry of Labor. I went to the Ministry of Labor. They came into the casino and violated the Health and Safety Act. Thus, they became enablers. And so here we sit with everything still going on and nobody able to check it up. And what's happening one more time, it's like the time machine, only this is like live, so to speak. You're watching liabilities grow daily against the Ontario government, because surely to goodness, people who've been victimized by gambling addicts, families and friends and relatives and whatnot, might be bringing a serious class action lawsuit against this casino and many others. You got to remember also the amount of abuse put upon casino employees up here and threats put upon them, and final threats like happen to me, you lose your job. If there was ever a shooting like there was at the Mandalay in Vegas, and they were looking for casino employees to help do a profile of the shooter, if it all worked out the same as what it did in Vegas, you're not going to get very many, if any, employees trying to tell the public or the police what's going on there, because they're afraid of their jobs.
Very interesting. And just a little segue, the intellectual property thing regarding the movies was the illegal bootlegging within the walls of the casino of American-made movies, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong.
That That's correct. And I wrote to the U.S. Movie Producers Association, and they ignored me. And they were always telling everybody, blow the whistle, and we'll help you out. Well, that wasn't the case. They just turned their back on us. And ironically, now with the movement of women in Hollywood and whatnot, I'd like to connect with somebody down there and tell them this is all of the efforts we've made to try and clean up the corruption, which festered itself into more and more abuse against women, as well as men. But women are the subject right now. But it's hard to contact anybody, even through the Me Too movement. It seems like we're just the little minions at the bottom of the gaming industry, if you call it that, and nobody listens to us.
And no one listening to you includes the press. And one of the things that has really struck me about your story, this broad-based story that you've told, is that the press is not only stonewalling this and not reporting on the myriad daily goings-on under the roofs of many casinos, including Casino-Rama. In fact, they're mitigating against people like you, and they receive such an enormous booty in advertising dollars from Ontario Lottery and Gaming, the OLG, that it's virtual hush money. Is that not what's going on?
That's exactly what it is. It's hush money, because I've had some contacts inside of the media outlet, and they all admit they can't come public with it, but they're saying that the money from the OLG buys silence. That's the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation.
And one of the only things that was done about casino gambling was the CBC's Fifth Estate show, and it did a laudable, admirable, I guess you'd say sufficient job of talking about the impact of casino gambling on individuals, individuals in debt $2, $3, $4, $5 million each due to gambling debts. And it said that at minimum there are 300,000 gambling addicts in Canada in a country of about 30 million, which is a little over 30 million, which is about 10% that of the United States population. But most of the population of Canada lives in Ontario, particularly in your greater Toronto area where you live. So the thing you told me, though, John, is that the Fifth Estate did not go nearly far enough. Do you think them or the other media will ever get beyond just the basic gambling hurts individuals mantra and look at these deeper issues? Do you see that on the horizon at all?
Well, it appears not, because I wrote immediately to Erica Johnson, another CBC publication up here called Go Public. And she writes back and tells me that casinos are not her jurisdiction. And like, I'm thinking, well, if it's not her jurisdiction, you'd think you'd walk down the hallway and give it to the people who did the documentary. That didn't happen. And she received a copy of our diary, 25 pages of what was going on in the place for a couple of years, and turned around and walked away from us. So obviously she's been counseled by somebody higher up that you can't say anything more about casinos.
Yeah, so what this boils down to is you have scandals around the world and in Canada, certain ones that get preferential treatment, but those tend to be more sporadic, here today, gone tomorrow kind of events. And yet under casinos, under what you've described as sweatshop conditions for many casino employees much of the time, you have daily problems, not just with the extreme downside of gambling addiction, but with all these other issues with workers at casinos and customers being victimized, sometimes the workers victimized by the customers, but the outgrowth of that being children and families hurt and torn apart, and enormous debts rung up by individuals. And yet the Canadian government is generating, I think if memory serves, $7 or $8 billion worth of revenue for the OLG per year. Isn't that the number that I heard?
Yeah, that would be Ontario. There was in that documentary about gambling, he said that Alberta, there was more money made from gambling than there was from oil revenues. And Alberta's a big oil province. So
yeah, was the number I cited only for Ontario?
I believe so, yes.
And so
the numbers are huge.
Yeah, staggering amounts of money going into the Canadian provinces as revenue. Much of that money shared to silence the media on most of the problems at the casinos. And yet 300,000 or more, and that was a minimum of, according to the CBC's Fifth Estate, 300,000 or more gambling addicts, some of whom are in debt to the tune of millions of dollars each. This is a huge thing that's being largely swept under the rug in terms of all the glitzy and glamorous ads that are put out about gambling. And I know that, John, at the Awakening News, you've been very careful to point out that casinos do bring some measure of jobs and spending power to the economy. And you've often been concerned about, as I understand it, something called the Woodbine. We'll put that on the screen. This is the other side of the coin, pardon the pun, that despite all these problems associated with casinos, that you're still concerned about the town you live in on Lake Simcoe, a city named Aurelia, and the fact that Casino-Rama does employ hundreds of people. They have paychecks, of course, and they buy cars and they buy goods in the community. And so there still is a some benefit or another side to the story in terms of casinos in your area. But yet, despite all these problems, and despite all the factors we've cited, John, the government in Canada, especially in Ontario, wants to build even more casinos. And let's show that Woodbine slide. What about Woodbine, John? What is Woodbine? And then you can talk about Pickering for a second.
Well, Woodbine and Pickering are two roads that you leave Toronto and you go north to Casino-Rama. Well, now when they put in these casinos close to Toronto, there's not a lot of people want to go up to Casino-Rama anymore. They're just kicking that into gear. The only thing that Casino-Rama had that the other casino didn't have was table games, but apparently table games will now be placed in these other casinos. So all of a sudden you're going to have a major movement of gamblers not coming up to Casino-Rama because they can access their casinos right in Toronto at the racetrack at Woodbine, for example. So all of a sudden we've got a shift in where the jobs are going to go to from the casinos, where Ray is going to lose a lot of jobs and economically blindsided, if you want to call it that, because the casinos now will be down around Toronto until the gamblers in Toronto run out of money. But they just kind of go deeper into the society trying to extract money from everybody. So yeah, Casino-Rama is in danger of being closed down the road here. And then we've got a major economic problem in the city of Aurelia itself.
And so despite all of this, what amazes me is all these dislocations and all these problems caused by gambling, they even want to take the one thing that does benefit Aurelia a little bit, and that's those paychecks earned by the Casino-Rama workers, and shift all that money down near Toronto to Woodbine and Pickering. And so even there, they really are so short-sighted in terms of how these casinos are operated. So it's really putting casino gambling into a very unflattering light, particularly in Canada. And there's a number of other things we could show here. And this one might be worth looking at. Casino-Rama, on top of everything, John, was hacked. It must have been about a year and a half ago. Maybe it's going on 2 years. What happened there? Let's kind of summarize some of your other headlines in the Awakening News.
Well, the hacking took place, and the people who are supposed to come in and police the hacking and whatnot, they subsequently got hacked. Our website got hacked, but the bottom line is that the hackers probably have ascertained enough information about the corruption on the roof of the casino that they could probably start using it as blackmail, especially if they hook onto our website and we're detailing all the stuff that's going on the roof there. Like, for example, the Freedom of Information, there's a law up here, what's it called? The Personal Information Protection Act. And they know that there was personal information stolen from our news outlet, as well as a movie producer's outlet, which is a violation of that act. So how can the people who are enforcing that act, if they ever did catch up to the hackers, prosecute it? Because the guys got caught saying, well, you better prosecute these other violators of the same act first.
And how many, for the record, how many people at Casino-Rama, how many people's accounts, past and present employees, as I understand, how many people's account data was affected, hacked and mined?
From the past to the present, everybody worked there, mine included. I suspect probably 6,000.
5,000 or 6,000 accounts of personal information. So here again, another dimension of the problems with casinos in Canada, as if we needed to see more. It's truly an amazing thing. And we'll kind of summarize some of the other headlines and matters. Here is the Wilson letter. We'll put that up just to kind of show how that looked. It was a brief letter, but again, he was conveying what you were contacting him about and conveying that to Kathleen Wynne. And a quick note about that is Kathleen Wynne, being a member of the Liberal Party, you contacted Rob Ford and Doug Ford, I believe it was. Doug Ford, correct? The son?
That's correct. They're brothers, Rob and Doug. Doug was mayor of Toronto.
Yes. Yeah, you contacted Doug, and because you felt that he, as a conservative, would want to know about the Wilson letter to challenge liberal win, and so the Conservative Party could make inroads and take control once again. Right now it's a liberal-run government, and even the conservatives wouldn't bite onto the letter to use that as leverage, would they?
No, and the election's going to be complete today and whatnot, and you would have thought that Ford would be all over this, that Wynne was being an enabler and covering up what's going on at the casinos. Why the leader of the Conservative Party decided to become an enabler, I would think, unless he's going to do something immediately after he's elected. But it would appear to me that the public doesn't know about it, and the party, a lot of people in the party don't know about it. But I personally asked the Conservative rep and up here, our own representative, to pass this on to Ford several weeks back, and he'd had to have received it, but he's done nothing.
Interesting. It almost suggests collusion between the parties and that they're not really at odds as much as we suspect, although that's just speculation for now. And just to summarize, go on.
You got to remember that I sent letters here about a month ago to all the presidents of all the parties and whatnot, and told them specifically about this Wilson letter, and they all choose to stay quiet. So it causes me to get really suspicious. There's something going on behind closed doors here that it's an affront to democracy.
Yeah, you've often said that democracy is being breached there. The rule of law is under extreme distress in Canada, and things of that nature. Anyway, we've looked at casino hacking and Woodbine and all these other issues. Combing through the headlines, we have another here, and it has to do with Canada's banking culture. Let's just kind of touch on these miscellaneous issues as we wrap up today's episode of Stop the Presses. What's this about? What happened in the banking culture? What was going on there?
Well, there's issues in the court today in regards to the owners of the bank, that being the citizens of Canada and whatnot. And there used to be a process where infrastructure projects were financed by the people's bank money, the Bank of Canada. And it was a good system. There was interest free. It was kind of a reward for us backing the banks and whatnot. Then that got removed, and all of a sudden now our infrastructure projects are costing us a lot more money because we can't access our own money.
Yeah, the Comer Group, the Committee on Economic Reform, I believe they're called for short, is trying to return Canada, correct, to the system you had between 1938 and 1974, where you had pretty much interest-free credit, and the Bank of Canada was by law more strictly required to operate in the public interest. Isn't that where the national health system that you have now came from, and some other laudable public projects? Isn't that right?
Yeah, I would think all of the projects up until 1972 or 74, whenever that happened, that was the driving force of how we financed everything. And then all of a sudden it got taken away from us. But a lot of people don't understand in Canada that if the Bank of Canada gets in big trouble and whatnot, we're gonna back it. Our money's coming out of our pocket to keep it going and all that stuff. Well, you would ask the question, well, shouldn't we get a reward for being that type of an insurance company? Anybody else who insures somebody gets rewards for it, but not the citizens of Canada.
Very interesting. We'll see how monetary reform and related matters goes there. And to summarize, to kind of put a period on the end of the proverbial sentence for today's broadcast, we're looking at this headline: Closed Government Fostering the Loss of Public Power, the OWLP. Give us a short synopsis of that, please, John.
Well, at one time, the citizens of Ray owned our own power generating stations up here, and over the years, big government and whatnot started to change the rules and whatnot, and all of a sudden, we, the owners of the Ray Water Light and Power, no longer own it. But the transition from ownership from one to the other is under question, but the media is not talking about it one more time. And the bottom line is that if there was enough money from the private sector to take us to courts, maybe we might get our power generating stations back again. But until that time, it's all in limbo. It's a time machine one more time. If the only way you can move the time machine along if you got a lot of money to play in the courts, and if you don't, it just sits there and festers.
And they want to force you onto that playing field where they have home field advantage. In other words, with this issue, as I understand it, you used to have a publicly owned electrical distribution system. They were going to build natural gas plants. You could have produced your own power in a sort of a greater municipal grid or framework, and that power would have been very cheap for the area's residents and could have even been sold to the larger Canadian grid, and that revenue could have come into your province and your community, and your electrical rates would not be sky high like they are now. I believe that's how it sums up.
Well, as it evolved, there's all kinds of people with solar panels out in fields and wind generators, big wind generators and whatnot, and they're all selling the power they generate into the Ontario hydro grid. So I'm asking the question, before that was even implemented, Ray Water Light and Power could have started up 1 or 2 or 3 gas generating stations to go above what they're already generating from their water power. And right now, we would be making a lot of money in supplying really cheap power, because the Ontario government, Ontario Hydro, is paying a king's ransom for the bit of power that they're using from the wind generators and the solar panels. Interesting.
And I think that this really kind of adorns today's show and puts things in perspective as we sign out. The first 2 words on this headline that we just looked at here, closed government fostering the loss of public power. And that doesn't just mean the loss of political power amongst the public, but electrical power. Closed government, closed media institutions, an entire non-transparent system has really fostered this whole thing. And it was closed government that really brought about the loss of your electrical grid, correct, among all these other problems?
That's correct. And of course, Ray owns another big problem here with closed governments. We ended up buying a piece of property for $1 to build an arena on. Subsequently, we found out it's polluted, and it all evolved through closed door meetings, and it ended up that it would cost us like $8,000 to clean up this, $8 million, I'm sorry, to clean up the site before we built the arena on it. And that whole thing took about 12 years, and most of it was done behind closed doors.
So closed door meetings that led to the loss of your electrical power distribution grid, closed door meetings that led to that arena matter that you just described, and a very closed door or tight-lipped situation among all these politicians about the Wilson letter, about all the gambling issues that are endemic in Canada. So you really have a democratic crisis going on, is what it all sums up to, and the time machine is what instills the status quo and keeps that democratic crisis going.
I've never seen and talked to so many people with the election coming up today that are so cynical about what's been going on in the democratic process here. Like, for example, about a week ago, the premier running for the premiership, she's already Premier Wynne, she announced that she's quitting. Well, what the one guy said, well, I went to an advanced poll and voted for her, and then I come out of the advanced poll and she quits on me. And you think there's one more nail in the coffin in regards to the death of democracy. Like, cynicism is just rampant up here. Nobody trusts anybody anymore. And I think the reason is because the media is covering so much up that we can't get the right information.
Yeah, I want to end by quoting this little piece from your article, one of your articles. Over the last few years, there have been threats and obstructions put upon earlier versions of our newspaper. Furthermore, Torstar, publisher of the Toronto Star, refused to respond to our inquiries, that's you, John, on deep-seated workplace safety issues, harassment problems, free speech violations, and corruption in the gaming entertainment industry, which includes casinos, of course. The gambling industry is growing so fast that the well-being and future of our entire Commonwealth, that being Canada, is being placed as a bet.
Yes, that's the summary of all of it.
Well, thanks for being with me on this third Stop the Presses, John. You've been listening to John Devine of Awakening News, and I'm Mark Anderson of Stop the Presses. We'll see you next time.